What if everything you think you know about homesteading security is backwards? That's the question nobody's asking. We talk about the laws that changed, the traps that got banned, the weapons that became illegal. But there's a completely different story hiding underneath all of that. A story about why pioneers actually stopped using these defenses in the first place. Not because the government said so, because they figured something out that we've forgotten. My name is Marcus, and I've spent the last 3 years studying court records, personal letters, and militia journals from the 1800s and early 1900s. And I found something strange. The deadliest defenses weren't the ones that killed intruders. They were the ones that killed the family inside. This is the story of why the frontier's most innovative security solutions became the frontier's greatest disasters, and why the real lesson isn't about what got banned. It's about what worked so well that people couldn't live with it. Let's start with the gun in the door. You've probably heard about Edward Briney, the Iowa farmer. In 1971, someone broke into his vacant farmhouse, and he'd rigged a shotgun to fire when they opened the bedroom door. The intruder survived, sued, and won. The court ruled that even trespassers have rights. That case became the legal foundation for banning booby traps in America. But here's what gets lost in that story. Briney's trap didn't just harm the intruder. It created something far more insidious. It turned a property owner into a murderer by accident. And that psychological weight, that's actually what killed the practice decades before any law did. Go back to 1887, Nebraska. A homesteader named William Hutchins set up a similar device, a loaded pistol rigged to a tripwire in his barn, where he'd been having trouble with cattle thieves. One night, his 12-year-old son went to check on a sick horse. He tripped the wire. The gun fired. By morning, William wasn't a clever security innovator anymore. He was a father who'd killed his own child. The case never made it to any history books, but it circulated through every settlement within 100 miles. Letters were written. Warnings spread. And quietly, systematically, frontier communities began abandoning these devices, not because they were illegal, but because the psychological cost was too high. That's the pattern that repeats throughout the entire history of these defenses. People didn't stop using them because sheriffs came calling. They stopped because they realized something terrifying. When you build your home into a fortress, you're not just keeping enemies out, you're trapping something dangerous inside. A state of fear, a constant readiness to kill, a world where every shadow could be your own son, coming home late from a neighbor's place. Let me tell you about something almost nobody mentions. The psychological illness that historians call frontier defense syndrome. It wasn't a disease in the medical sense, but it was documented extensively in personal accounts from the 1880s and 1890s. Settlers who invested heavily in elaborate security systems, multiple layers of traps, reinforced doors, weapons positioned at every entry point, began exhibiting what we might now call hypervigilance, taken to its absolute extreme. They couldn't sleep because they were listening for sounds that might trigger their defenses. They couldn't be relaxed around family members because they were constantly aware of sight lines and firing angles. Some families reported that the head of household would sit motionless for hours, watching for threats that never came. The home had stopped being a place of safety and become a prison of their own making. The letters are what got me. I spent days reading accounts from wives and children of men who'd built elaborate fortifications. One woman, Margaret Blackwood from Colorado, wrote to her sister in 1891, "He has turned our home into a guard post. The children whisper now, afraid that loud noise will set something off. He sleeps with weapons and wakes screaming. I do not know if he fears the outlaws or if he has become one." That letter was never published. It sat in a family archive until someone donated it to a historical society. But it tells the real story. The traps didn't just kill intruders. They killed something inside the families that lived with them. The strangest part of all this is that the most effective defenses weren't the ones that hurt people. They were the ones that simply announced danger. The tin can warning system, the gravel pathways that crunched under feet, the geese that would alarm at any movement. These worked brilliantly. They gave you those crucial seconds of warning. And they didn't require you to kill anyone. They didn't create the psychological burden of a booby trap. They were simple, effective, and they let you live without constantly preparing for violence. Yet when settlers could afford it, they often upgraded to more sophisticated systems. Why? Because a warning system isn't enough when you're afraid. When fear is in control, you want certainty. You want to know that nothing will ever get past your defenses, and that's where everything goes wrong. There's a legal case from 1923 that most people don't know about because it didn't become a major precedent, but it changed everything in quiet ways. A man named Samuel Whitmore in Missouri had built what was essentially a home defense system designed to be non-lethal but maximally disorienting. spring-loaded floorboards that would collapse under an intruder's weight, causing them to fall into a pit filled with deep water. The idea was that they'd fall, splash around, get scared, and run. No one would get killed. Samuel tested it. It worked. Then one day, a neighbor's boy got into the compound. He triggered the mechanism. He fell into the pit. He panicked and drowned in 3 feet of water. The boy's father sued. Samuel was charged with manslaughter. And here's the thing that shocked people at the time. The court didn't need to be told that killing is wrong. Samuel wasn't denying that. What the judge said was something different. He said that when you set a trap, even one you believe is non-lethal, you surrender your right to know who will trigger it or what will happen. You are, by definition, creating a weapon you cannot control, and that makes you responsible for anything it does, regardless of your intentions. That ruling, though it never became a Supreme Court decision, circulated through legal communities and sheriff's offices. And it changed how people thought about home defense. It shifted the burden from, is this trap legal, to, can you really control what you've created? And that question was far more terrifying than any law ever could be. The fascinating part is that this creates a pattern in the historical record that most historians completely miss. You can actually trace the moment when each defense system started disappearing from frontier settlements, and it never aligns with when laws were passed against them. Take the iron window bars that everyone talks about. The history books say they disappeared because of fire codes enacted in the 1940s and 1950s. But if you look at actual construction records from frontier towns, the use of iron bars peaked around 1885. By 1910, barely anyone was building them anymore. That's 30 to 60 years before fire codes even existed. Why? Because people discovered something. Those bars that were supposed to keep threats out also kept you isolated from the world. If you were inside during a fire, and fires were far more common than intruders, you had minutes to escape. But if there was violence in the settlement that you needed to flee, your own fortress became a cage. Settlers started choosing visibility over total security. They started choosing the ability to see and be seen over the possibility of being safer. I want to introduce you to a different kind of source material here. In the archives, there are actual journals where pioneers describe not what they built, but what they dismantled. A settler in Kansas named James Peterman kept detailed records. In 1891, his journal describes his elaborate security system in precise detail. Then, in 1897, there's an entry that changes everything. He writes, "Today I removed the bars from the north windows." Sarah laughed, real laughter, when she saw sunlight without the shadow of iron across her face. "I have been afraid for so long that I forgot what courage looks like. It looks like an open window." That's not metaphor. That's not poetry. That's a man realizing that his security had cost him something more valuable than what he was protecting. I need to pause here and mention something important. If you're interested in the full court records, the actual letters, and the complete timeline of how these decisions were made across different regions, I've put together a deep dive resource that's available in the description and pinned comment. It goes way beyond what I can cover in a video, and if you're genuinely curious about the psychological and legal history of this topic, it's absolutely worth reading. But here's where the real story gets interesting. Because once you understand that these defenses disappeared for psychological reasons before they disappeared for legal reasons, you start seeing a pattern. The defenses that survived longest were the ones that didn't require constant vigilance, the ones that worked passively, the ones that gave you peace rather than adrenaline. Geese, graveled pathways, bells on tripwires, simple warning systems. These didn't disappear from settlements because they were banned. They disappeared because suburban and urban development made them impractical. Geese don't work in a city. Gravel paths don't work on a paved street. But the principle, the idea that security could be gentle and still effective, that principle stuck with us. Now, fast forward to today. And here's the counterintuitive part that nobody wants to talk about. Modern home security has actually returned to the philosophy that pioneers discovered through painful trial and error. We don't recommend booby traps. We don't recommend hidden weapons. The National Center for Victims of Crime, insurance companies, and law enforcement all recommend the exact same things that finally worked on the frontier. Visibility, awareness, simple deterrence, locks that keep honest people honest without creating moral burden, motion sensor lights that announce your presence, cameras that observe without judgment, security systems that alert you, and authorities without requiring you to do the killing yourself. We've basically reinvented what the settlers finally figured out after generations of trying more violent approaches. There's one more layer to this that's crucial. The laws that were actually passed, the ones that banned various traps and fortifications, most of them weren't about protecting intruders. That's the mythology. The Briney case is held up as this great example of the law protecting criminals. but if you read the actual decision and the legislative history of booby trap laws, the stated purpose was almost always about protecting innocent people. The idea was simple. Once you build a hidden trap, you've created a weapon that cannot distinguish between a burglar and a lost child, a firefighter, a police officer responding to a call, or your own family member coming home at night. A booby trap is indiscriminate. And indiscriminate weapons are dangerous to everyone in a community, not just intruders. So the laws weren't anti-self-defense, they were pro-community. They said, effectively, that your security cannot come at the cost of safety for everyone else. That shift, from individual absolute security to community-balanced safety, that's the real revolution. And it's the one thing that people miss when they romanticize the frontier. The frontier was efficient at many things, but it wasn't efficient at community safety. Settlements where everyone had maximum individual defenses actually had more violence, not less. Because when everyone is armed, fortified, and hyper-vigilant, conflict escalates faster. A misunderstanding becomes a shootout. A trespasser becomes a casualty. And everyone is traumatized by the constant readiness for violence. There are a few specific instances that historians point to as the real breaking points. In 1889, there was a shootout in a Wyoming settlement that technically never happened. A family had installed an elaborate trap system around their property. A group of cowboys cut across the land at night. The traps activated. In the confusion, in the noise and chaos of the alarms, someone on the property fired. Someone else fired back. By morning, 3 people were dead. The investigation later showed that nobody had actually intended to engage in violence. The cowboys were just taking a shortcut. But the defenses had transformed an innocent act into a war. After that incident, which became known locally as the Whisper Creek Incident, Wyoming ranchers began actively dismantling their trap systems. Not because of law, but because they'd seen what happens when you create weapons that respond automatically. They respond to innocence and guilt equally. The geese, though, the geese were different. There's an amazing letter from a woman named Eleanor Sutton in Nebraska, dated 1903, where she describes what she calls the goose piece. She had tried everything. Booby traps, reinforced doors, constant vigilance. Then her daughter convinced her to get geese for eggs, and Eleanor writes that for the first time in years, she could sleep. The geese would alert her to anything unusual, but they wouldn't kill it. They wouldn't hurt anyone. They were a warning without a weapon, and somehow that made all the difference. She could have security and humanity at the same time. She could protect her family without building a prison around them. This is the pattern throughout all of this. The defenses that survived weren't the ones that were most lethal. They were the ones that were most human. They worked with community instead of against it. They gave warnings instead of delivering punishment. They allowed for mistakes and accidents instead of creating death traps. And most importantly, they let the family living there remain psychologically intact. You could have geese without living in fear. You could have reinforced doors without going insane from hypervigilance. You could have security without sacrifice. What's remarkable is that this entire story, this shift from lethal to harmless, from automated to conscious, from trap-based to warning-based, happened almost entirely without legal mandate. Laws came later. They formalized what communities had already figured out. The real change happened when enough people realized that living in constant preparation for violence was a kind of violence itself, that you couldn't build your way to safety with weapons and traps, that genuine security required community, trust, and the ability to distinguish between threat and innocent mistake. Now I want to offer you something more substantial, the complete analysis of every major defense system, from the technological failures to the psychological costs, plus the actual letters and diary entries that show why each one was abandoned. That's all available in the pinned comment and the channel description. This goes deep into the specific economics and social dynamics that made these changes happen. If this topic fascinates you, that resource will absolutely expand your understanding. There's something else hiding in this story that almost nobody talks about. The economic cost of elaborate defenses. A family that invested heavily in security. The iron bars, the reinforced doors, the trap systems, the weapons, was a family that wasn't investing in things that actually made their life better. They weren't building additions. They weren't improving their land. They weren't developing community infrastructure. They were spending resources on the assumption that the worst would happen. And most of the time, it didn't. A settler in Colorado named Marcus Holloway kept meticulous financial records. In 1885, he spent nearly 8% of his annual income on security upgrades. Iron bars, reinforced windows, motion-triggered alarms using pulleys and bells. Then, in 1890, after a period of relative peace, he stopped. By 1900, his journal notes that he'd invested those same resources into education for his children, improvement to his land, and development of community relationships. He wrote that he'd been wealthier before but happier after, because he wasn't constantly afraid. This is the profound lesson that nobody draws from the history of frontier defense. The decision to abandon these systems wasn't a defeat or a legal burden, it was a victory. It was communities saying, collectively and without any law forcing them, that there was a better way to live, a way that didn't require constant readiness for violence, a way that didn't turn your home into a weapon, a way that didn't destroy your psychology in the name of safety. The geese survived because they were gentle. The gravel paths survived because they were simple. The warning bells survived because they let you respond rather than react automatically. And the booby traps disappeared, not because they were illegal, but because everyone who lived with them wished they could get rid of them. That's not a legal story. That's a human story. The final thing I want to leave you with is this. The United States did eventually pass laws against these defenses, but those laws were essentially codifying something that had already been rejected by the people who had to live with them. The law came after the cultural rejection, after the psychological rejection, after people had learned through bitter experience that security purchased through fear is no security at all. It's just a different kind of danger, a danger you've created inside your own home. So when we look at the laws that ban booby traps and elaborate fortifications, what we're really seeing is the law catching up to wisdom, the law formalizing what people had already discovered, that a home doesn't become more secure by becoming more violent, that community safety and personal safety aren't opposed to each other, that the most effective defenses are the ones that prevent escalation rather than ensuring destruction. That's the story the frontier didn't teach us at first, but eventually forced us to learn. If you want to explore the specific legal precedents, the psychological studies that came later, documenting what living with booby traps actually does to families, and the complete economic analysis of why communities moved away from these systems, I've gathered all of that in a comprehensive resource available in the description and the channel description. This is the kind of material that will fundamentally shift how you think about security, community, and the actual history of American settlement. Check it out if you want to go deeper. Thank you so much for watching this exploration of how frontier communities learned, through sometimes tragic trial and error, that the most secure home is one where you don't have to live in fear. Please hit that subscribe button and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we explore the unexpected histories, the counterintuitive stories, the angles that everyone else is missing. Like this video if it changed how you think about security, and drop a comment. I read every single one, telling me which historical lesson surprised you the most. See you in the next one.